Well, thank you so much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. It feels like it's against the odds, but we're all here, I guess by definition. Those of us who aren't here are not here. Stop me if I'm losing you, especially the machine at the back. Look, I don't want to use any more of your valuable time on this banter. I want to get straight to some hard truths about the world. I'm going to give you the information you really need. I'm going to tell you where babies come from. Now, you may have your theories about where babies come from. I don't want to hear your disgusting ideas. I'm going to tell you the truth. And the truth is what my mother told me. You see, I'm the oldest of 4, and every time one of my baby sisters appeared, mysteriously, I would ask my mother, well, what's going on? Where did this come from? And my mother would tell me, well, it's the stork. You know, it's a great big sort of bird, and it has this sort of fluffy blanket, and the stork flies in and drops off the baby, and that's where babies come from. Now, you may doubt this. Are you calling my mother a liar? No, must be true. But you are believers in data, so you will want to see the data. And as it turns out, I can prove that storks deliver babies using data. All you need to do to see this, you can collect the data yourself if you want, is just get an estimate of the breeding population of storks across Europe, different countries, and also the number of babies born in each country. And you will see a striking correlation. Countries with lots of babies have lots of storks. Countries with not many babies, not many storks. But you might say, but Tim, does this meet conventional scientific standards of statistical significance? At least I hope that's what you would say. To which I refer you to the literature. There is indeed a paper published with the self-explanatory title, Storks Deliver Babies, P equals 0.008. And I don't want to get super technical, but as many of you will know, all of those zeros after the decimal point are evidence that this is not a coincidence. Correlation between storks and babies is rock solid. At this point, you may be wondering how the trick is done. Or you may have figured out how the trick is done. It's fairly simple. Just call to mind a few countries that don't have many babies. Monaco, Luxembourg, Vatican City. Not a lot of room for storks. And then the countries that do have quite a lot of babies, Germany, Turkey, Poland, France. Big countries. Lots of room for babies, lots of room for storks. It's really that simple. What I've given you is a correlation. The correlation is real, but the correlation is that both babies and storks are closely related to whether a country is big or small. Now, if this example is sounding familiar, something very like it was outlined in the most famous book ever written about statistics. It was published in 1953 to rave reviews by a journalist called Darrell Huff. And the book was called How to Lie with Statistics. And it's great. It's a terrific book about all the different ways in which statistics can be used to mislead. Maybe by politicians trying to persuade you to vote for them. Maybe by advertisers trying to persuade you to buy toothpaste. Maybe the error is just innocent. Maybe people just made a mistake. But in any case, there are lots and lots of different ways in which the data can lead us astray. And Darrell Huff's book is full of them, full of funny examples, full of really telling cartoons and graphs and charts. And it's vivid, it's entertaining, it's unforgettable. And I read this book as a teenager, and this was my introduction to statistics, to thinking rigorously about statistics. And I think it was a lot of other people's introduction as well, because as I say, it's the most popular book about statistics ever written. And of course, it's got an argument that storks and babies are statistically correlated. But while the book is very entertaining, very informative, the more I think about it, the more I start to worry about Darrell Huff's little book and the message that it gives us. Because the one thing that's really missing from How to Lie with Statistics is the idea that statistics might be used to find the truth. And it's very easy to fall into the trap of looking for deception, of assuming that the statistics are lying to us, of assuming that we can't trust the data. Because that's kind of more interesting, it's more funny, it's more kind of cynical, it feels more savvy. And yet, if that's what we do, if we're just reflexively disbelieving the numbers, because we know, well, there are lots and lots of ways that the numbers could lead us astray, I think we can potentially get to a pretty dark place. I mean, what happens if you just disbelieve everything you're told? That can't be true, that's not true, that's the mainstream media leading us astray, that's fake news. Pretty soon you're wearing antlers and you're storming the Capitol. That's what disbelief looks like when you take it to an extreme. When we think about conspiracy theories, conspiracy theorists, we often think about them in terms of credulousness. These people will believe anything. I don't think that's the right way to think about conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theorist is really somebody who is disbelieving everything. Indiscriminate doubt can be just as damaging, perhaps more damaging, than indiscriminate belief. And to have the most famous book ever published about statistics to be all about how statistics can be used to lie, that's a problem. And I think it's a challenge to all of us, and I hope I'm speaking to my fellow nerds here. It's a challenge to all of us that this is the way that people think about data. This is most people's introduction to data. This is, as I've said, the most popular book about statistics ever written. And there is an irony, because just a few months after Darrell Huff published How to Lie with Statistics, two British doctors, Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill, used statistics to solve one of the most important mysteries in public health. They produced, for the first time, really persuasive statistical evidence that smoking cigarettes will give you cancer. Now, they weren't the only people to be investigating this. It wasn't like they published one result and that was it, but it was a very important contribution. And when you think about the value of that contribution, the value of that discovery, it's astonishing, the number of lives that have been saved by deploying statistics to solve this mystery, which is why are so many people suddenly developing lung cancer? And by the way, people didn't know, and people thought, I think quite plausibly, it's quite likely to be something to do with cars. I mean, you've got all these new asphalt roads, sort of smell they give off, the cars, their exhaust, their fumes. That might well be it. But it wasn't the cars. It was the cigarettes. And discovering that has saved millions, possibly hundreds of millions of lives. So I find that quite striking, that there's this moment in history, the early 1950s, where you've got these two visions of statistics. You've got Darrell Huff saying, it's a joke, it's a game, it's like going to see a stage magician. Sure, it's entertaining. You can. Some of the tricks are spectacular, but don't ever make the mistake of thinking it's actually magic. Of course it isn't. And by the way, I'll teach you how some of the tricks are done. And then you've got Austin Bradford Hill and Richard Doll saying, it's not a trick, it's not a joke. This is deadly serious. If we can really use data to understand the way the world works, the stakes couldn't possibly be higher. So I've written a book, by the way, you can tell. There's subtle subliminal messaging. Thanks for that, guys, appreciate it. The message of the book is embrace Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill's vision of statistics, not Darrell Huff's. Use statistics as a way to help understand the world, not as a way to try to knock everything down. Okay, it's all very well to say that that's what we should do, but then how do we do it? What advice would I give? And I think there are there are basically three main theories about why we get statistics wrong. Okay? And I think there's truth in all of the three theories. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but I think some of the theories get more attention than others. So the first theory is incompetence. We get statistics wrong because we don't know enough about statistics. We misread the data because we can't do maths, or we can't do basic computer science. We just don't understand basic statistical principles. And clearly some of that is true. There's a certain amount of incompetence around. Just look around. I mean, not in this room, obviously not in this room, but just look over there across the river. You'll see it. Bit of politics there, ladies and gentlemen. Now, so that's one theory, incompetence. And the second theory is what psychologists call motivated reasoning. That's basically you're acting like a lawyer in a court case. So a lawyer in a criminal case is either acting for the prosecution or is acting for the defense. And the idea is that everything the lawyer says for the prosecution is to try to convict the suspect. Everything the lawyer for the defense says is to try to acquit the suspect. That's their job, and there's nothing shameful about that. But very often we act like prosecutors or defense lawyers when we're thinking about numbers ourselves. We're trying to make a particular case. We're working really, really hard to reach a particular conclusion. And that's fine. The only problem is we often don't even know that we're doing it. So we're fooling ourselves because we're desperate to prove a particular result, because we have this very, very strong view of the way the world works. And that overwhelms any technical judgment we may have, because our emotions are so powerful. There's a third theory. And the third theory is kind of crazy how simple it is. The third theory is we make mistakes because we're just not really paying attention. We're busy. We're just sort of scrolling through on Twitter and we're distracted. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on, and we're just not really stopping to think. And there's pretty good evidence for all three of these theories as to why we make mistakes. Now, one of the challenges is that for each of these problems, so incompetence, motivated reasoning, and inattention, for each of these problems, there's a kind of meta problem, which is that we just don't know what we don't know. So we like to think that if we were technically incompetent, we'd realize it. We like to think that if we were biased, we would understand our own biases. And we'd like to think that if we weren't really paying attention, at least we'd know that we hadn't really been paying attention. Turns out none of these things is true. So the psychological evidence on this is really sometimes amusing, sometimes disturbing. So you may well have heard, it's quite famous, of the Dunning-Kruger effect. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is sometimes oversimplified as stupid people are so stupid they don't know they're stupid. Which is, it's not really what the Dunning-Kruger effect is, but the Dunning-Kruger effect basically says that we all have areas of competence and we all have areas of incompetence. There's stuff we know how to do and there's stuff we don't know how to do. And there are those boundaries between what we know how to do and what we don't know how to do. And the Dunning-Kruger effect basically says it's very hard to know when you've stepped across the boundary. When you've stepped into the world where actually you don't know what you're talking about and you don't know what the data says and you don't have the skills to process it. Because one of the things about not having the skills, one of the things about not having the technical competence is you often also don't have the competence to realize that you don't have the competence. You don't have the judgment to realize that you're lacking the skills. So it's very easy to get into a situation where you think you're still on firm ground, you think you still know what you're doing, and actually you haven't got a clue. So that's the Dunning-Kruger effect. But it's got parallels, and the other two theories about what goes wrong. So remember, motivated reasoning is the second theory, inattention is the third theory. So motivated reasoning, this is often summarized as the I'm not biased bias. So you read all these books about how everyone's biased, and you look around and you say, well, everyone seems to be biased. But somehow we never really feel that we're biased. We never really feel that the motivated reasoning applies to us. And you can kind of intellectually understand that you must have your own biases, and you must have your own conclusions that you're subconsciously straining to reach. But it's one thing to sort of understand it on a conceptual level. It's another thing to feel it. Of course, we don't feel biased. I mean, if you think about it, why would you ever look at the world and say, my judgment is way off, I'm massively biased off to this side on this question? Like, well, if you actually felt that, you would say, well, I better correct my bias and be back in the middle, hadn't I? I bet, you never, if you really, really felt that your judgment was badly skewed in one direction, you truly believed that, you would correct your judgment back so it was as accurate as you could make it. So instead what happens is you read the Daniel Kahneman books, and you think of yourself as yes, there's bias, and lots of people are biased, and I suppose I'm also biased, but I'm not actually biased on any particular question that I happen to be addressing right now. I'm biased about some other stuff that doesn't matter, that I'm not thinking about. So you've got the Dunning-Kruger effect. You're incompetent, you don't know you're incompetent. I mean, nothing personal. I also am incompetent. Then there's the I'm not biased bias. So you're trying to reach a particular conclusion, trying to prove that a particular strategy is working. You're trying to prove that your product is outperforming the other products. You're having an argument in the pub about which political party to vote for, and you're biased because we're all biased, but you never quite feel that you're biased. And then there's this inattention question, and there's this thing called inattentional blindness. We really do not know that we're not paying attention. Our brains are incredibly good at persuading us that we are really taking everything in. And I'm sure you must have recognized this if you've ever done something like you've been listening to a podcast while maybe doing the ironing or something, and then there's something about the ironing. I mean, yeah, I'm a new man. I do the ironing. Ironed the shirt. Yeah, thank you very much. Ironed the shirt last night. That's pretty okay. You're doing the ironing, or you're doing something, and you're listening to a podcast, you're listening to the radio, and then you realize actually you haven't followed anything they've said for the last 4 minutes because there was some very technical crease that you were dealing with. And you have to go, and you didn't notice the point at which you stopped paying attention. You didn't notice that you'd stopped paying attention. Or if you really want to see this demonstrated, there's an amazing TED talk by the pickpocket Apollo Robbins. And it's quite short, it's about 9 minutes long, and he just pulls somebody out of the audience. And just constantly, he'll say, have you got anything in your pocket? You got your wallet in your pocket, and the guy will check his wallet, and while he's checking his wallet, Apollo will remove his watch, and then he'll say, now of course you're realizing I've got your watch, and the guy will look at his watch, and Apollo will take the wallet out of his pocket, and you just see it happening. You can see, and you're like, how is he not noticing this? But it's because Robbins is just direct. Look at that, touching. And you just can't focus on everything. But your brain is telling you that you can. Your brain is telling you that you are noticing, and you're not. And by the way, the end of that TED Talk is fantastic, because right at the end, he makes you realize that as you've been watching the TED Talk, you've completely failed to notice something that you would absolutely swear that you would definitely have noticed. But you didn't, because we don't. So, 3 problems. 3 kind of fundamental problems that are not really to do with data at all, that explain why we get things wrong. You've got incompetence, simple technical incompetence, and the Dunning-Kruger effect says you don't realize that you're out of your depth. You've got motivated reasoning, you're biased, and you're trying to reach particular conclusions, and the I'm not biased bias says you don't ever really feel that you are biased, because if you really felt that you were biased, the bias would have gone away. And then you've got lack of attention. You're just busy, you're scrolling, little screen, lots going on, and you just accept something that's true, that if you stopped for a moment, you'd go, well, that can't be right. I really need to understand how that happened or where that came from. And then you've got inattentional blindness. You simply don't notice. None of us notice the things that we've failed to pay attention to. There's this powerful illusion that we've been paying attention all the time. So, how do we solve all these problems, which are, as I say, are kind of fundamental? Well, I think we can't solve them, but we can certainly address them. We can certainly try to ameliorate them. And that's why the advice that I give tends not to be highly technical advice. You can get great technical advice, whether it's software solutions, whether it's kind of mathematical techniques, whatever it is, you can get great technical advice from lots of places. But my argument is all that technical advice isn't going to help you if you don't know what you're doing and you don't know that you don't know what you're doing, if you're biased to reach a particular conclusion and you don't realize you're biased, and you're not really paying attention in the first place. None of that stuff will help you. So my advice is much simpler in a way, and in another way it's harder, because we're really getting to the core of what makes us tick and the way we think, and trying to change that a little bit. But if I wanted to boil it down into the simplest possible message, it would be 3 C's. So they are calm, context, curiosity. So let me start with calm. Okay? So much of what we see is designed to outrage, upset, make us laugh, make us fearful. And that's particularly true of anything that's gone viral on social media. It's particularly true of any headline that any TV or newspaper editor has decided should be prominent. Emotional engagement is what drives everything. I mean, I really notice this on Twitter. Whenever I look around and I see people I respect, it's the point at which they say something that really gets people going that suddenly all the retweets come. So when somebody gives you a simple piece of quite dry information that helps you understand the world, it's very unlikely to go viral. Now, there's nothing wrong with being emotional. There's nothing wrong with seeing something that really inspires you, sort of brings happy tears to your eyes. Or there's nothing wrong with seeing a terrible injustice and feeling anger. But none of that is helping you think clearly. And I'm really struck the number of times we see misinformation being spread by people who are trying to speak up for really worthy causes. Charities, fundraisers, and you see super important causes that you really sympathize with, and then you look at the numbers, you just think, I can't believe I'm going to have to take that one down. But that's the thing. People retweet this, people spread this, people believe this because they're emotionally engaged. So it's fine to be emotionally engaged, but notice that you're not calm. Notice that the Twitter headline or maybe that PowerPoint slide that someone's put up in the boardroom is giving you the feelings. And then just observe that. Observe how you're feeling. I mean, if I may quote my statistical mentor, Darth Vader, search your feelings. And then having observed that you have this emotional reaction, then go back and have a look at the tweet again, or look at that PowerPoint slide again, or read that article again. And maybe you'll find, it all adds up. That message that I got that made me so angry or that made me so optimistic, it's true. But you give it a second read, having paid attention to your emotions. And this deals with 2 of the problems I've talked about. It deals to some extent with your biases, because a lot of these biases are driven by an emotional reaction. And it deals also a little bit with inattention. So I'm just saying, slow down, think twice, go back and have a second look. I mean, we all are subject to these things. I mean, I find, so I saw, this is a few years ago now, before I was really thinking hard about this kind of problem, but I saw a graph on Twitter that was showing support for gay marriage in the US and showing how sharply that support had risen. And as it happens, I've got strong personal reasons to feel that this is very good news. And I wanted to share this good news with everybody. And so I just retweeted it to about 75,000 followers at the time. And the very first response was, Tim, did you look at the axes on that graph? To which the response was, oh no. No, I didn't. I didn't look at the axes. I just saw, oh, that looks like good news. I think the graph was from the Washington Post. So I'm like, good news, good source, tweet. I must have thought about it for approximately 0 seconds. Yeah? And I think if I had looked, I would have said, okay, well, yes, good news, bad graph, something to clip for my bad data visualization file, not something to just retweet to everybody. And now I try to have that habit of just slowing down for a moment. It doesn't take long, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. You know, I'm not saying you need to write a doctoral thesis on every tweet you see. Just slow down, notice that emotional reaction, notice how it might be guiding your response. When you go back, you see these things in a slightly different way, sometimes in a profoundly different way. So I said I'd give you practical advice. So actually, I didn't think I said it would be practical, but it will be practical. Under promise, over deliver. That's my motto. So in the form of the 3 C's. So C number 1, remember, was calm. So notice your emotional reaction, try and step away from it for a moment, go back to the data, having registered that you are having that emotional reaction. So the second C was context. And context, well, context is more complex. There's lots and lots of different things that context could mean. But a few that I would highlight, I mean, half the book really is about context, but a few that I would highlight. One is just, when I see a number and I'm starting to engage with this number, do I have a sense of scale? Do I have a sense of history? Is it a big number? Is it a small number? Is it going up? Is it going down? What are useful comparisons that I could make that would help me understand this number? So, for example, you might compare revenue at a company with revenue at some of the competitors. You might compare revenue at a company with revenue last year or 10 years ago. You might find other comparisons. There are different sort of ways that you can bring context to a number, but it's always useful to just try and ask yourself, what is it that I really need to understand before I understand this number? One of the problems that I personally suffer from as a nerd is premature enumeration. And I find a lot of people who are really comfortable with numbers suffer from premature enumeration. What is premature enumeration? Premature enumeration is grabbing the number and getting to grips with the number and sticking it in the database or slapping it in an Excel spreadsheet or whatever package you're using to process this number, drawing the graphs, drawing the conclusions, here's the trend line, here's the correlations, without ever going back and going, hang on a minute, what was that number again? Where did that number actually come from? What does that number actually mean? Very, very common to have these numbers thrown around, but we really don't understand the process that produced the number in the first place. And then that's when people get really confused. So, I mean, just to give you a super simple example, very often you get arguments as to whether the number of nurses in the National Health Service is going up or going down. And the answer usually depends on your definition of a nurse. And you think, well, how can there be an argument about the definition of a nurse? Well, of course there's an argument about the definition of a nurse. Well, 2 part-time nurses. Is that 2 nurses or is that 1 nurse? Well, it kind of depends. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer to that question. It could be 1 nurse when you're thinking about how many people do I need to staff this hospital and meet patient needs, but it's 2 nurses if you're thinking about, well, how many people do I need to give training to? Do midwives count as nurses? What about community health visitors? I mean, you can see really passionate arguments arising over this number that nobody ever bothers to actually define. And if you actually go and define the number, then you get your answer. And it's incredible how often I'll be listening to the radio in the morning and my wife, there'll be some number and we'll hear it. And my wife will say, because she imagines, I mean, she's known me for nearly 25 years. She still imagines I've got this massive list of facts at the back of my head. She'll just go, so is that true, that thing they just said? I don't know. But very often the answer is quite simple. It's like, it all depends on what they mean. Like they have said that a certain number is going up or a certain number is going down or a certain number is 25% different to what it was last year, whatever. And nobody has actually said what the number is that is being crunched and discussed and projected and percentified. Now this stuff really matters. So, I mean, you see all these arguments over the effectiveness of vaccines. And you're like, well, what do you mean by effective? What does it mean for a vaccine to be effective? Do you mean that it prevents you from transmitting a virus? Do you mean that it prevents you from getting a virus at all? Do you mean that it prevents you from getting sick? Do you mean that it prevents you from going to hospital? Do you mean that it prevents you from dying? They're all perfectly valid measures of vaccine effectiveness. It just astonishes me the number of times you go, well, these vaccines are 80% effective or whatever. 80% effective at what? Compared to what? Against what? We don't know. 80%. It's not. It's a percentage. It must be right. Yeah? And this is the thing. It's not that the number is wrong. It's not that the number isn't telling us something useful about the world. The number is telling us something useful about the world, but it's only telling us something useful about the world if you attach the label. If you don't attach the label, you just got the number, you've got nothing. And of course, the more people are comfortable with numbers, the more they'll just go, great, I've got the 80%, and away I run. And I'll understand how that 80% has increased or decreased over time, or like I'll make a big list of comparing all the different vaccines with all the different numbers. And so, if you don't know what those numbers are measuring, if you don't know what the label is, you don't know what you're talking about. All the maths is right, and yet you still have learned nothing about the world. And I know it's all feeling a little bit 2080 around here at the moment. So do you remember 2008? One of the things, some of you are too young and spry to remember 2008, but I'm an old man. I remember 2008. Total global economic meltdown, total financial meltdown. Why? Well, about 100 different reasons. But one of the main reasons was very sophisticated financial engineering being done on risk. So there's risk, all these different assets have risk. And what we're going to do is we'll measure the risk and we'll chop up the risk, and then we'll restructure the assets so we can sell different parts of these assets off that have different risk profiles, and then we can repackage the repackaged assets and sell them all off. And then suddenly there's this light bulb moment where everyone goes, that risk thing that's in all the Excel spreadsheets, like, how did we measure that again? Like, what actually is that thing? We've done all the analysis. The analysis is super sophisticated. What is the risk, actually? And the answer is, well, somebody made up some particular metric that is kind of fine. It's not a terrible measure of risk, but lots and lots of different circumstances in which it doesn't tell you what you need to know. And because of premature enumeration, that idea of risk has been built upon and built upon and built upon and built upon. And in the end, something like $1.25 quadrillion worth of bets on this metric that nobody really understood. And I don't want to get technical, but 1.25 quadrillion is a lot of dollars. And that's how you melt down a global financial system. Premature enumeration. Another piece of context I think it's really useful to understand for those of us who are using data in organizations is the data being used to measure and to understand, or is the data being used to control? Now, both of those things are, I think, legitimate uses of data, but they tend to have quite different implications. Because the moment data is used to control, like we're going to push more resources here, we're going to give some bonuses there, we're going to fire this person, promote this person, whatever, based on the data, that's when you need to be careful. Because that's when the data start to twist and warp under the strain. Because data are never a complete picture of what's going on in the world. They're always just a proxy. Sometimes they're a bad proxy, sometimes they're a good proxy. But when you start using data to try to control the world, to try to reward people, to try to reshape organizations, that's when the gap between the proxy and the reality gets tested. And that's when you need to be careful. So let me give you this is so well known in the social sciences that different social sciences have different names for this phenomenon. So in economics, it's called Goodhart's law. In sociology, it's called Campbell's law. But basically, it's like when you've got a measure and you use it as a target, it's not a good measure anymore. So let me give you an example of this. So the most famous example probably is in the Vietnam War. So you've got Robert McNamara, who used to run Ford. Corporate titan, becomes the head of the Department of Defense. And he's in charge of running this war that's going on the other side of the world. And, well, you know, he likes to use data. He's used data at Ford. It's been very effective. But what data do you need to run a war on the other side of the world? Well, not territory, because it's not a territorial war. It's a guerrilla war. So in the end, they think, well, if we kill a lot of the enemy, we're probably winning. So they introduced the body count metric. The more enemy soldiers you kill, the better things might be going. Now, the first problem is that might not be true, actually. It might not be true that if you kill a lot of the enemy, the war's going well. But also, the metric, which might have been a good measure of success, I mean, it's questionable whether it's a good measure of success, but it might have been a good measure of success while it was just a measure of success. The moment it becomes a target, and the Department of Defense is saying, we want the body count, it's important, people will get promoted if they have the right body count, then weird things start to happen. So, you start redefining dead civilians as dead combatants. That's bad. It's particularly bad if you decide to redefine the civilians as combatants and then kill them to inflate the body count. Really bad. Or you get really weird things like there's been a military operation, we've killed some of the enemy, they're over there, but we don't know how many we've killed. We've got to send some men across the valley under machine gun fire to go and count the bodies, because if we don't count the bodies, we don't know how many we've killed, and we've got no body count. So really bad things can happen when you take data that you're measuring and you use it as a target without thinking about it. Now, of course, we need data, we need to measure, and I think we need targets as well. But whenever that's happening, that's a really important piece of context. You have to think really, really hard about how good the data are, about how good what they're measuring, how well they're measuring what's going on, and about ways the data can be gamed. It's a huge challenge. I think it's one of the biggest challenges of a modern data-driven economy. And it's not something that you sometimes hear people saying, oh, well, should just not use data then? That clearly doesn't work. But you need to be very, very sensitive to that piece of context. The data was a measure, always an imperfect measure. Now it's a target. That's the danger. Pay attention. Pay close attention. So I said that I'd give you the 3 C's. One was calm. One was context. Context, of course, means all sorts of things. It means this stuff about whether the number's going up or down, whether the number's big or small, how is the number being used, might the number be being abused, what is the label, where did this data actually come from, and what does it really mean? All of this comes under the question of context. And it's incredibly important for anybody who's dealing with data, anyone who's dealing with statistics, to have the maximum amount of context available. So what's the 3rd C?
Curiosity.
Yes, thank you. Not only listen, remembered. That was supposed to be rhetorical, but in fact, I did tell you the 3rd C 15 minutes ago, didn't I? I did. Thank you. Oh, wow. It's the sort of the shocking feeling of somebody actually listening to everything I'm saying. It's very, very unnerving. I hope it's all been making sense. So curiosity, why is curiosity important? Curiosity is important because it helps you with that context. It's giving you the motivation to dig deeper and to look behind the numbers. Curiosity helps you be calm. Because I think when you look at data in this slightly combative mindset that a lot of us have, I'm going to use the numbers to prove that I'm right and you're wrong. Very, very common, especially if you hang out on Twitter. When instead you look at the numbers and say, I'm going to use the numbers to understand the world, because I really want to know what's going on. And the world's a very interesting place, and I don't really fully understand it. That's a totally different mindset when you're approaching the data. And that's where instead of just quickly doom scrolling, quickly retweeting, you start going, oh, that's interesting. That raises questions I don't really understand. I want to know more. I want useful comparisons. I want to know what's going on behind the data. So that curious mindset is an incredibly powerful one. Now, people sometimes ask me, well, how do I know this idiot, and how do I use data to persuade this idiot not to be an idiot? And my general answer is, well, look, you're also an idiot, I'm also an idiot, we're all idiots. Could we just start with trying to be less idiotic ourselves, rather than trying to fix anybody else? Maybe we should start with that. But if pushed, people say, yeah, but this person really is an idiot, and really need to get him to be less idiotic. Well, what do you do at that point? Well, one of the things that I would try to encourage you to do in that situation is to try to awaken that person's curiosity. If you're having a conversation where the two of you together are exploring an issue and trying to understand it and asking genuine open questions, you're in a much more constructive, much more problem-solving mindset than if you're just constantly trying to prove somebody wrong. And then there's a wonderful famous study about something called the illusion of explanatory depth. So basically, what you do is you ask people, so how well could you explain a zip fastener to me on a scale of 1 to 10? How well do you think you understand a zip fastener, or a flush lavatory, or a bicycle? And people will go, oh yeah, I think I'm like maybe 8 out of 10. I can tell you how a zip fastener works. And then you go, great. Here's a pen. Here's a paper. Could you just sort of draw me some diagrams and really explain how it works? At which point people start to struggle with the flush. Why does the water and they realise they don't actually know how a flush lavatory works. They don't actually know how a zip fastener works. And what's more, when you invite them to explain, they realise they don't know. And at that point, people will back away from their previous claims and go, actually, I think I'm more of a 5. There's a follow-up study where people did this with policies, like global cap and trade system, unilateral sanctions on Iran. And the same thing, people would have these, oh yeah, I've got these very strong views about unilateral sanctions on Iran. And then you go, great, just don't tell me why you believe in unilateral sanctions on Iran. Just explain to me, like where's Iran? And what are sanctions? And what does unilateral mean? And how does it work? And then people are like, oh yeah, actually I have no clue what I was talking about. I was willing to die in a ditch over this policy that I don't understand it at all. And then people will back away. So getting people to explore their own curiosity is incredibly important. Of course, they may actually know exactly how a flush lavatory works, or exactly how unilateral sanctions on Iran work. At which point, when you ask them the question, when you show them some respect, you're about to learn something. That's even better. When I think about curiosity, I think about Richard Dole and Austin Bradford Hill back in 1954, and think about them trying to solve this incredible mystery of why lung cancer was going through the roof. And there's this great conversation. So they sent out questionnaires to every doctor in the country. It's about 60,000, 70,000 doctors, most of whom smoked. And one of these doctors got hold of Austin Bradford Hill at a dinner party and said, oh, so you're the chap who wants us all to quit smoking, are you? And Austin Bradford Hill said, not at all. I just want to see how you die. If you quit smoking, I want to see how you die. And if you don't quit, I want to see how you die. So quit or don't quit, it's all the same to me. I'll chalk up your death anyway. And it'll be very useful. By the way, Austin Bradford Hill and Richard Dole both smoked when they began the study. And they both quit halfway through. That's what it means to be data-driven. That's what it means to be curious. And the opposite view is when the data's all a game, the numbers are all a game, you're just trying to win some kind of political battle. I was really struck in the 1960s when there was a Senate hearing. US Congress was trying to decide whether to put health warnings on packets of cigarettes. And they got all these expert witnesses in, cancer specialists, epidemiologists, and others, to testify. And one of the expert witnesses came before Congress and said, well, it's undoubtedly true that there's a correlation between smoking and cancer. But, there's a correlation between storks and babies as well. Statistically speaking, I can prove that storks deliver babies. And the chair of the Senate committee said, do you seriously mean to tell us that there's as casual a connection between smoking and lung cancer as there is between storks and babies? And the expert witness said, well, they seem to me about the same. His name, Darrell Huff, author of the great statistical educational book, How to Lie with Statistics. He'd been hired by the tobacco lobby. He was working on a sequel, which thankfully for him, as well as the rest of the world, was never published. The sequel was How to Lie with Smoking Statistics. It's all about taking down the arguments of the oncologists and the epidemiologists and all their fake correlations showing that there was some connection between smoking and lung cancer, which there obviously wasn't. That's where the cynicism gets you. That's what happens when you think it's all a game. That's what happens when you've got that facility with statistics, you speak the language of statistics, but you're not really very curious about the world. You just want to win. Austin Bradford Hill and Richard Dole weren't interested in winning, they were interested in understanding. And that's the vision of data that I think we all ought to follow. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak. Thank you very much for listening.